Are you interested in a career in cybersecurity? Are you currently in law enforcement and looking to learn more about technology and cybersecurity? If so, please consider joining us for our master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers like my two co-hosts on this show and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. This is designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that works with your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more. We hope you can join us.
Welcome, everybody, to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. My name is Tom Holt. I'm a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. I'm also the director for the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training. And I'm here with my two wonderful co-hosts, as always.
I'm Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the center.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor. I, too, am an assistant professor at Michigan State, and I also am an associate with the center.
And today we have a fantastic guest with us. She has been studying hacking and cybercrime for quite a while. Let me bring on Dr. Marleen Weulen Kranenbarg, who's an assistant professor at the VU University in the Netherlands. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this last night. We met almost 10 years ago, I think.
Yeah, I think so. During my PhD trajectory, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it's been that long. What got you interested in cybercrime?
Well, so I'm a criminologist by training, and I think during my both bachelor's and master's, cybercrime never was a topic. I think we never discussed anything related to cybercrime. And then when I was in my master's, I heard about this job opening for a PhD on cybercrime and the human factor in cybercrime. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I have no idea to what extent I can apply the theories that I've learned to this type of behavior. So that's how I actually got interested in the topic. And once I started looking into it, I got more and more fascinated on the unique characteristics of the type of behavior that we're looking at. So that's what got me interested in the topic.
So what's been your main area of focus lately? I know you have a lot of different projects.
Yeah, so maybe to give a bit of history, my PhD dissertation actually focused on that sort of looking at theories, traditional criminological theories, and to what extent they apply to cyber offenders, and also empirically comparing cyber offenders with traditional offenders. And then during that process, I talked a lot to ethical hackers at different conferences and other events. And I realized that many of the results that I found on cyber offenders were actually also applicable to them. So I realized, okay, well, maybe if we really want to understand how this behavior develops, but also how people actually use those skills for the good, we should also look into their behavior as well. So then as a follow-up after my dissertation, I started or at least applied for a funding for a project on ethical hacking, which I eventually got, which was really nice because that really enabled me to look at this sort of positive trajectory and positive pathway for hacking specifically. And in addition to that, I also look more at sort of the educational context. So I've done quite a large quantitative study among students in IT education in the Netherlands. And I think that study is sort of the in-between study where I would look both at criminal behavior as well as positive behavior and also see that there's a big overlap between the two. So I guess that whole range from crime to ethical and everything in between, I guess that's where I mainly focus on, more on the cyber-dependent offending side.
So with that research, have you found, or I guess when you were doing it, what were some of the similarities you found between the people that were offending in the hacking space versus those that were ethical? What were those commonalities?
Well, interestingly, I think before I started looking into ethical hacking, there were a few of these sort of what we would call risk factors. So having a very young interest in IT, starting very young, first hacking your school, stuff like that. And interestingly, I found exactly the same with these ethical hackers. So they also have they are also very young when they start to get interested in computers or other types of technology. Many of them first start hacking in their small social environment. So that means their home or their school. And what interested me there is that apparently something different happened with some of them, because they actually eventually ended up doing it in a good way. And I guess those people in your small social environment are very important in those early stages, because I noticed that at least the ethical hackers that I spoke to, they say, well, the school, for example, invited me to help fix the problem, or they guided me towards better ways of doing this. So I guess, or some of them, for example, have strong mentors in their social environment. So I guess that shows how you can really divert people into the positive path early on.
Can you talk a little bit about what ethical hacking looks like in comparison to, you know, I guess illegal hacking, or what people typically think of when they hear the term hacking?
Yeah, I guess it's a very good question, because I think that also really depends on in which country you are,
Mm.
and who you talk to as well. So I also, even my respondents, so the people that I think are ethical hackers, they clearly disagree on what
Mm.
is ethical and is not ethical hacking. But I guess if you would look at it more broadly, the easiest way to hack ethically is to ask for permission. So either by asking it, or by having a job and being hired to find vulnerabilities, for example, as a pen tester, or if you do bug bounties, those kinds of situations, it's clearly that you're sort of invited to find vulnerabilities. You clearly often sign a contract, for example, showing that you would stick to certain rules, that they also maybe excluding certain aspects of the environment that you're testing. So I guess that's the clearest example of what would be considered ethical hacking. But then there's also, at least in the Netherlands, a big group of people that do this more sort of as a hobby, or at least in their spare time. Some of them, they would find vulnerabilities by specifically looking at it. So in the Netherlands, many companies have vulnerability disclosure policies that indicate that, well, if you use these rules and guidelines, we will not prosecute you, or we would invite you to come to our headquarters and explain what you found, or we would put your name on a wall of fame if you want that. So that's also clearly in sort of an invitation, but not something that you discuss beforehand with the company, like saying what exactly you're going to do. Um, and then I think in the Netherlands, that's generally the way people would hack ethically. So either in their job or in their spare time, but by reporting it then to a company and helping them fix it, or at least wait for them to fix it, and then afterwards disclose it if they agreed upon that. Um, in other countries might be different. So not in every country that last form of hacking would be considered ethical or non-criminal. So that also makes it a bit difficult to look at this in a more international perspective, I think. And there are also many rules and guidelines are changing in many different countries. I know that in Germany, they lately changed the rules and guidelines around ethical hacking, and I think they even legalized it, which is more than what we did in the Netherlands. So it really depends on where you are, what would be considered ethical hacking. And then even it depends on your own perspective, I guess, because for my respondents, for example, some of them say, well, I only think that it is ethical if you're not getting paid for it. So some respondents really see it as it has to be a sort of personal drive to make the world safer and better and more ethical and more safe digitally, while others say, well, a pen tester is also an ethical hacker, or a bug bounty hunter is also an ethical hacker. But there are also respondents who say, well, bug bounty hunters often sign non-disclosure agreements, which basically means that they cannot then tell the rest of the world what they found, which some people say, well, that is not ethical, because then actually not everyone can learn from what you have found, and may not be able to fix similar problems in similar systems. So yeah, there's a lot of ambiguity there, I guess. But it's that's what makes it fascinating for me as well, that it's not clearly binary either. ethical or criminal, but there's this big gray area in between.
I wonder, because it's an issue that comes up a little bit here in the US as well. This notion of ethical hacking is great, but you just touched on the idea that corporate entities can limit the ethical release of information. And I know in the States about a little less than a decade ago, we had the release of multiple vulnerabilities that were massive due to an NSA breach of vulnerabilities they were just sitting on, which led to WannaCry and a bunch of other kinds of attacks. So I wonder if you can talk at all about that tension. Have any of the people you've interviewed talked about the difficulty of corporate or government regulations on what they can say versus their desire for public disclosure?
Well, I think they might also be a bit reluctant to talk about that. So I haven't heard much about it. What I do hear is that they, the hackers that I spoke to, they also decide on their strategy based on where they find a vulnerability. So, for example, if they know a specific company and they feel like these people don't treat ethical hackers well, they might not report it, for example, or they might go through an intermediary. For example, the National Cybersecurity Center might sometimes be able to act as a person in between and negotiate in between the two. So they do think about, okay, what kind of organization is this and what can they maybe do with the vulnerabilities that I find. And in that case, I think those interviews were more focused on like coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So really finding something yourself and then reporting it to the organization. When you start looking at bug bounties, for example, then I have seen at least some that say, well, I do specifically choose which companies I want to work for or not. But that is more sort of they also see that more as a job, I would say, because they really can pick it themselves. And some of them simply look at, okay, who pays best for the vulnerabilities, while others might have more moral considerations on which companies they want to work for or not.
So I'm really fascinated by this idea of ethical having sort of two meanings, both legal and moral ethics, right? Like where that line is. And so I wonder if you found, individuals that maybe have spoken about their dipping into the less ethical, more illicit hacking, and have more legitimate jobs now, or if it's maybe flipped, they start more legitimate and moved towards illicit hacking. But can you kind of describe how that middle ground is of the people that kind of fall in both parties?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is that I think a few months ago somebody asked me, have you ever talked to an ethical hacker that said, I never crossed the line? And I think I didn't, at least not as far as I remember. So I guess if you want to develop these skills, if you want to get good at it, if you want to test the boundaries of what you can do, I think it's very difficult not to cross any legal or ethical boundaries. But I think the people that eventually turn up in the right path learned from that and learned where those boundaries are. So yeah, it's not as if you can say, well, this person has only did ethical hacks, for example. I think I still have to find the person that says, well, I never did anything that crosses any boundaries. And it might not always be that they actually committed crimes, but at least they might at some point said, well, I went too far there, or I later found out that what I did actually caused a lot more harm than I expected it to be. So no, I'm not entirely sure to what extent you can say there's this clear ethical path. It's more that's also why I sometimes, when I start selecting people for my interviews, I just say, well, I want to know what made you end up in this ethical position where you are right now, because I think that's interesting. But even then, some of them say, well, it depends on the situation, how I would deal with a vulnerability that I find. And while they might not commit crimes with that, they might still think, well, in some situations, I just don't take the effort to report the vulnerability, for example, which might also still be for some might still be something that they say, well, that's not morally or ethically right to do that.
What are some of the motivations that come up across these ethical hackers as far as are they doing it for ideologies, protecting systems, financial benefit, things like that?
Yeah, I think many of them start more of out of this idea of I want to make the world safer, better. That's really what they describe, at least how they see it when they're young. They feel like, okay, I can really, with these skills, I can make a difference. I can make the world safer. Um, while later on, they get sort of more social influences as well. So later on, they might find role models that sort of stimulate them to further develop their skills and do more with it. Or they might find that the owners of the systems where they report vulnerabilities respond really good to it and really stimulate them to do it again. Or they want to be in these walls of fame to sort of build their CV and their career. So I think it starts more as out of sort of at least, of course, a curiosity for technology, and then also this sort of drive to make the world safer and better. And then later on, some of them start to see, well, I can actually I get good responses from other people when I do this, but I also might be able to build a career out of this. So then, of course, there was also some other motivations coming there as well.
So, since hacking and security are really just two sides of the same coin, how do we improve young people's understanding of, hey, here's a better way to apply your skills? It seems like there's potential for diversion here in ways that aren't equivalent for traditional crimes. There's no way necessarily to talk about armed robbery as a pathway into security as a job. I mean, yes, with a huge but, but there's no real
Mm-hmm.
equivalent otherwise.
Yeah, so I guess here, at least in the Netherlands, we see a lot more initiatives in that area. So we, for example, we developed, I developed together with some people from the vocational schools in the Netherlands that teach IT. Um, we developed some educational materials in this area because many of these students do get sort of general moral principles and guidelines during their studies, but they do not discuss that very specifically within the context of IT. So I guess what we sort of need to find ways for them to help them translate general moral rules and guidelines to their digital context in which they do most of the stuff that they do. So I think in education, at least, there's a big opportunity there to divert people, or at least to guide them to the right decisions, or at least help them to morally reflect on those decisions and make the decisions themselves. But then, of course, you do only reach the people that are in education. And I think maybe that is less of a problem now than it was like 10 or 20 years ago, because right now I feel like most people that have an interest in technology will find in some way or another education in that area. But there are also other initiatives in the Netherlands, at least, where we do these things outside of school. So at least where you can go to like a hacker space or other types of sort of more informal education where luckily many of the people that are there are sort of older hackers or mentors that can help young people to guide them towards the more ethical paths.
So, given the changes in technology and in the tools that are available for hackers, has anyone talked about the difference? I mean, when I started interviewing hackers, it was 20 years ago. But even then, they were talking about the difference between these hackers today versus the hackers when I was young, because you had to,
Mm-hmm.
pull out the giant manual and computers were really hard to use. And now we're at a point
Yeah.
where you have cybercrime as a service and all these other resources that simplify cybercrime so much. Has anyone talked about a difference in somebody who's an ethical hacker now compared to what an ethical hacker looked like before?
Yeah, so there are a few respondents who definitely talked about generation differences. Also in many different ways. So, for example, what you described just now, but also the extent to which rules and guidelines were clear. So when the older generation hackers grew up, there were no guidelines, there were no rules. It wasn't clear what you can and cannot do. So they sort of had to develop that sense themselves. And I guess many of them are also the ones that say, well, it's not like I never did anything criminal in the past. But they learned how to work with those skills in a good way, I guess, in a sense. So that's one of the things, differences in the extent to which the rules and guidelines are clear. And then also education again. I think that in many programs, really like education on hacking or more offensive security is something that wasn't there much yet in the past. And for example, I also talked to quite a few people who said, well, I started just as a developer, or I started just somewhere in like a IT consultation or whatever. And I kept on doing this stuff on the side because I thought it was fun until I realized that I could make a career out of it. So both education as well as job opportunities in this area really increased a lot in the later years. So that really made it easier, I think, for the more younger generation to get also on an ethical path.
So, from my understanding, a lot of ethical hacking, in terms of the professional side of it, comes through earning certificates to say, I am an ethical hacker and I can do X, Y, Z. So, I wonder, do people you talk to, do they have these certificates, or are they kind of operating on their own? Do they see it as something worth, going after and earning? I wonder.
Yeah, so I think the certificates are very interesting because I feel like many of the well, there are a few certificates that the hackers really value a lot themselves as well, because it takes like a 24-hour sort of challenge to show your skills, and then if you are able to finish it, that's like really really an accomplishment. Um, and some of them might even value that more than sort of like university education, for example. But many other certificates, like there's this, what I don't know, certified ethical hacker or something, what it's called, and those certificates are seen more as well. Yeah, my employer wants me to get that because the customers want to see that I have it, but they really don't see it as something that they value. So some of these that, and I think that those are the certificates that really are really challenging. Those are valued in the community. And many people now have them, at least when they have a job in IT somewhere or as a pen tester or an ethical hacker. I think many of them have that also because their employer pays for it and expects them to get it. Even if they apply and they don't have it yet, then they expect them to get it when they work there. So yes, they are important, but maybe more from the employer side than from the community side.
You spoke about how difficult it is to do this research internationally. And when you're talking about kind of their guiding perspective among these ethical hackers, it's this desire to make the world a safer place. And when I think about our country, the United States, I don't know that I immediately identify that kind of for the greater good motivation, at least visibly. I'm not saying it's absent entirely. And again, that's because our country is so large and so heterogeneous in so many ways. But so, how much of kind of how these ethical hackers work and their motivations, how much of it is cultural and how much of it is kind of specific to that cultural structure in a way?
Honestly, I don't really know because I haven't looked at it in other countries. I do feel like in the Netherlands we generally have a very sort of open culture where we just debate and discuss, and if we don't agree with each other, we might also agree on disagreeing. And that might be really helpful here because you can say, well, at least we talked about it and we might not agree on what we can and cannot do, but at least we discussed it openly and publicly. And I think also the guidelines, for example, in the Netherlands, they really came bottom up. So the community themselves felt like, okay, but we have this criminalization of hacking, but we are actually doing something good, and we need to find a way to make the justice system see that and use that when they decide whether or not to prosecute. So the hacker community first came with their sort of guidelines and principles, and then the Dutch Cybersecurity Center came into play and discussed it with them and developed guidelines, and then the Public Prosecutor's Office eventually developed the guidelines. So I think what is interesting here is that it really is a bottom-up process. That I'm not sure if that would work in a very, very big country as well. So yeah, I think maybe also because in the Netherlands, I think the sort of core hacker community, they know each other, and that makes these processes also easier, I guess.
Yeah, that's kind of an odd question on my part, but I'm going back to like, my critical criminological theory courses and thinking about cultural explanations of crime and even just the construction of conflict, like who is the good party in these scenarios, who is the bad party, and the construction of an ethos. So maybe down the line, that's a project to pursue cultural comparisons of hackers.
Yeah, well, that would be really, really interesting, I think, also in many perspectives. So this would be interesting, but also this educational aspect that we just discussed, because there are many differences between countries in the extent to which they teach ethical hacking, but also the extent to which they teach moral and ethical guidelines in the area. And also, if you look at sort of international competitions and challenges, like capture the flag kind of challenges between hackers and hacker teams between different countries, some countries are always first or second place. So they clearly do something good in this area. So yeah, I would love, if I find more funding to do that, I would love to do those kind of internationally comparative studies, because that would be really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. I would imagine in some countries where IT jobs are not plentiful or don't pay as well as criminal opportunities, if that kind of drives why would I be an ethical hacker? I make more doing what I do, as opposed to, yeah, I can pivot to a cybersecurity job.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be the case. So I think the research that I've done so far is really among people that see a very, very good paid job in cybersecurity. And for example, so some of the respondents said, well, what if I get caught for criminal hacking? Then who would look after my cat? I'd rather get almost the same amount of money in an ethical job. Why would I take the risk, but that's a luxury, I guess, to say that in the Netherlands, because you get paid very well if you work in IT. But yeah, that's not the case in every country.
So we've kind of touched on this in the area of like university education and certificates, but I'm thinking about when I talk to my undergrads about hacking and how it develops and how people get into it. I think about the social learning aspects and how they basically teach each other, these different things. And so I wondered how you saw that kind of play out with the people you've talked to. Are they going to certain resources online? Are they, certain people they know that will teach them how to do XYZ? How do they kind of rely on each other in this more ethical space?
Yeah, so I think social aspects are very important, mainly in the sort of further development of their career. So many of them start sort of more of on an individual level, and then at some point realize that there are other people that like the same things, and that might sometimes take a while before they realize that. And then quite a few of the respondents discuss role models. Often these are role models in their close social environment. But what I'm working on right now, together with my PhD student, Janina Eggers, is a project on how they might also use these online environments to socially learn from others. And that goes a lot further than only like social learning in the way we would normally define that in criminology by looking at the definitions and etc. But more also on how people use these online forums and other places to learn both skills as well as the norms in the general community, and how some people might really interact with those environments while other might not. So I don't think I have much information on sort of the extent to which offline versus online resources are relevant. I think both are, but also still offline resources are really valuable there. I think many of them do describe social relationships with others, either people they have already in their social environment or people that they meet online and then meet in person. And for example, in the Netherlands, we also have this hacker camp every 4 years. That's really popular and where people really meet who normally would not meet in person. Um, and I do also remember one respondent, for example, saying that he organized something for a few of his online friends, and then he made name tags with their hacker handle on it. So not their real name, but their hacker handle. And then some people finally met in person after so many years only talking to each other online. So it's interesting to see how they might really develop a connection with someone online, learn a lot from them online, and then might even be more impressed in real life. So there are many social dimensions, as I guess, as well. Yeah.
Do you see that those relationships and that network building solely online, or do they still have people in their physical circles that are influencing that behavior? Because right, I think to kind of the pathways of criminality, your peers when you're young are so important, and so if your peers are doing drugs, you're going to do drugs. But I wonder, with these being more online spaces and people who really are maybe less social to begin with, are they developing out their network solely online, or is it still kind of a combination of both?
Kind of a combination, I think, and it really depends on who you ask. So as I said before, some might later on only sort of realize that other people like this too. So they start really individually, and then they find out, oh, I'm not the only one who actually likes doing this. And that's usually because they find people online, or I also know an example of someone who had a teacher in school who said, oh, maybe you want to go to this hacker camp. And then they went to that hacker camp, and that was like sort of an epiphany, like, oh, wow, there are other people who like this too. There's a community where I can be a member of. So yeah, it really depends on who you ask. And there are also even people that say, well, I always did this a bit on myself, and I still don't feel as if I'm really part of this hacker community. So there's a really big range in there as well, of people that say, well, I just do it for my job. I develop my skills myself, and I don't really interact with the community or go to all these conferences and meetings. So it really depends on who you ask.
Just like being an academic, kind of choose your own path.
Yeah,
Either go to
exactly.
happy hour at the conferences or you go back to your room. And either way, you do the work.
Yeah, exactly.
Do the ethical hackers that you talk to, and I understand it might not be part of the conversations you're having with them, but do they ever share their views on red or black hat hackers, like those who dedicate all of their time and skills to, breaking systems and more illicit purposes?
We don't discuss it much. When we do discuss it, it's generally in the context where we discuss what would you consider to be ethical hacking, or sometimes some of them say, well, I really don't like that word ethical at all. Just call me a hacker, because all the other people that you describe as a hacker are actually criminals. So I think there they do see that, well, these people are just criminals. Don't call them hackers. Then yeah. So I think that's mainly what we would discuss about it. And then on the other end, I also know people that, for example, have been clearly criminal hackers, but are now on the ethical path. So there's a lot of variation there. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've noticed lately in looking at the literature, 10 years ago, we used to have people doing subcultural research and a little more of that in-depth qualitative interviewing of hackers. And it seems like there's been a real change away from qualitative investigation more toward quant in different ways. I know you've got a lot of different data sets looking at the issue. The more qualitative pieces from Dutch scholars and otherwise kind of look at the networks of offenders as opposed to talking to hackers like you're doing. I wonder, can you talk at all about how what you've learned so far mirrors what we know, or what do you see as the real difference between what we used to know about hackers and that kind of interviewing style versus what you're hearing now?
Yeah, so I think what interests me there, I'm not sure if this is an answer to your question, but at least I think it's something that's interesting, is that if you look at survey research or more quantitative research, that often just looks at hacking as if it is always criminal. And learning from the qualitative interviews that I do with hackers and the extent to which at least even one specific person can decide in different situations different things, and you might not always call it morally justified or ethical. I also started to look again at the quantitative data that I collected, and then sort of realized that maybe the questions that we're asking people might not always capture this behavior very well. So I think what we do learn from this combination of quantitative and qualitative research is that if you want to study hacking behavior specifically, you really need to be careful about how you describe that in your questions. For example, in the data set that I have among IT students, I looked at the extent to which there's an overlap between positive and negative behavior. And there we really defined the negative as anything that was without permission. And that's generally what we do in surveys. We ask, to what extent did you hack into somebody's system without permission? And then on the other hand, I looked at like participating in IT or hack events, bug bounty programs, responsible disclosures, etc. But then there's a large overlap between these two behaviors. And at first, I thought that's because people do both positive and negative behavior. But now I think it might also be that the people that do it without permission still do it for a better, to make the world safer. But we simply just don't ask them about that. We don't ask, okay, but what are you doing after you hack that? Or what are you doing with the data that you got? And given that some of the qualitative respondents that I spoke to are sometimes also very clear in boundaries or in what they consider ethical or not ethical, or when they consider something applicable or not, they might really look at these questions very clearly and carefully and say, okay, yeah, I did that, without getting the context of that we're actually asking, to what extent did you do this for like a criminal purpose, for example. So something that I do want to think more about and develop better is how we should actually measure this behavior, because I think we might not capture that correctly at the moment.
Something that's a real struggle too. How do we ask people about hacking in a way that is going to make sense to them, but isn't a super long question if we're doing a quantitative survey? It's always a difficult thing.
And I was trying to think through in my head as you were speaking, like, what would that question look like? And you'd have to include so many caveats, right? And then, like you said, the definitions of what is ethical or not are so fluid between individuals. That's a whole project on its own, just designing and validating hacking measurement.
It is, certainly, yeah.
So with the growth of like the cybercrime as a service industry, how are these ethical hackers viewing these pre-built systems, right? Do they see it as beneficial, getting more people involved, or they see it as lazy, people not, putting in the work that they should be? I wonder kind of what that relationship is between the as service side and the legitimate or ethical side of it.
Not sure if I clearly talked about that. I do know of quite some ethical hackers who clearly use all these tools if they can. But some of them, for example, they do sometimes talk a bit about, pen testing, that's just running some tools. to see if you can find anything that's clearly visible, but it's not like real hacking, for example. So there you might see a bit of that perspective. Okay, like only using those tools, that's not real hacking. You really need to be able to find new or different things that you cannot find with these tools. But then on the other hand, I've also seen people use these tools very creatively, which means that I would still consider that sort of creative or new way of using technology. So yeah, it might depend also a bit on if you think like if pen testing is hacking and is ethical, then some of them might really say, yeah, well, it's just something you use to find as much as you can. But then I think some respondents might really say, well, but you need to do sort of more to really make sure that you find everything or that you're really considered to be an hacker.
Kind of along the lines of what Taylor was just talking about, have any of the interviews you've done so far touched on how AI or even pre-built tools that, like in the US, you find a lot of companies that will do vulnerability scanning, and it's just an app that tells you do XYZ. It's not really you physically doing it. It's more kind of a process guiding you through it. So did anyone talk about how technologies are kind of limiting the skill that certain people need to move into ethical hacking, or touch on any of the technological changes that are maybe making ethical hacking easier?
Not specifically, but I had to say there has been a bit of a gap in between the hacker interviews, expert interviews, and now doing hacker interviews again. So the really like big AI changes are not in those interviews yet.
Mm-hmm.
I do know from other study that's more on criminal hackers that they clearly use AI in especially when they're stuck. So if they cannot find a way around something, then they might use it to find new opportunities, possibilities. So I can see how that can make it easier. But no, I haven't talked about it in these specific interviews.
Is there anything that you're planning on asking about in your newer batch of interviews that's different from the interviews you've done before? Like what are the directions you're looking to go?
Yeah, mostly on the moral development. So in the earlier interviews, this sort of moral drive of making the world safer, as we discussed earlier, it came up a lot, but we didn't really dive deep into that topic yet. And I do really want to see where that comes from or how they translate sort of offline moral values to online moral values. Because it does seem to be one of sort of the crucial aspects of their development. So it looks like this is one of those things that is really different from more criminal hackers.
Now, you've recently been doing interviews and talking about the work that you're doing at a large Dutch cybersecurity conference. Can you talk
Yeah.
a little bit about what that process is like? We talk about research on here, but sometimes we don't get into the nuts and bolts of issues like this. So I'm just curious, how did it go? How was it received? Is this something you plan to do a lot in the future? How does this fit into success in research?
Yeah, well, that was really interesting. Yeah, so there's this big cybersecurity conference in the Netherlands that is organized by, among others, the Cybersecurity Center of the Netherlands. And they it's really a community that I'm normally not in because it's really cybersecurity and not cybercrime or criminology or human factor. But there's a lot more attention towards the human factor in cybersecurity there than it was like I don't know the 10 years ago when we first met Tom. So I think it's interesting that our proposal for this discussion was actually accepted because I think a few years ago that would definitely would not have happened because they wouldn't have really seen the value of it. And what we discussed there is basically when, where, how should we teach ethics to future IT professionals, so people that are now in education and have these skills and interests. How do we teach them the right moral and ethical values to make sure that they use them in a good way in their future jobs? And we we invited experts from like the whole range of education that you might have. So from primary school up until university level, and basically everything in between, to discuss how can we help these people develop the right moral values and skills to more really reflect on their behavior. And what was interesting there is that when we started discussing it, we thought, okay, it's interesting that we think it's interesting to teach them more sort of like contextual morality. So how do you apply moral values in a specific context? While many people also say, yeah, but we also need to teach general moral principles, because we never know what technology will look like 5 years from now. So we need to sort of give them the principles and guidelines that will still help them to make moral decisions in their jobs even 5 years from now, which we cannot really see what might actually be happening then. So it was a really interesting discussion. I think it was very interesting to see that the public was very broad. So from both people from practice, from academia, from different kind of interventions in this area. Some cybersecurity companies as well, who said, well, we actually might be able to play a role here, or who said, well, it doesn't stop with university education. It actually goes on beyond that, because we might even need to help our employees with the right sort of way to discuss these things with their colleagues, for example, to make the best decisions. So it was a really interesting discussion. Also, at these conferences, you only have we had 45 minutes for a topic that I think we can do research on for 10 years. So it really was also just to spark some ideas and get some inspiration, but also some new contacts, and hopefully also just build up on that in the future with future projects. And also more I think more in-depth future events, more small scale, to discuss these things, because at such a conference, it's really sometimes a bit too big to really get into the deeper discussions.
One thing I know, we talked about certificates earlier, and this notion of being an ethical hacker. Yes, there are certificates for that. And yes, there's continuing education and ways to get certificates in all these different areas of cybersecurity. One thing that I've noticed, if you look at some of the bigger security certificate providers here in the US, there's not any discussion of ethics, morals, the social side of hacking in general or cybersecurity as practice. It's very much just no tools, skills, blah, 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 which absolutely, that makes 100% sense. But given what we've been talking about so far, do you see something like, a small couple of hour module that if somebody wants to be a certified ethical hacker or be certified as a CISSP, hey, your continuing education should also include some social, moral, other elements every year?
Not so much yet, although I do feel like there's more. I'm not sure to what extent that's an aspect of these certificates. I really feel like these are mostly about either the technology itself or how to report it. I do see some developments there as well, which is also interesting, because if you really want people to do something with the vulnerabilities that you find, you also need to find a way to report it so that the management also understands it. So that's also a social skill, and I think that might be a bit more developed. But really on the social side and on the morality side, etc., I don't see much there. While I do think it's very important, also because you might feel like people in this area often think of many things as very binary. That's the way the technology generally works. While in these cases, you sometimes really might need to discuss with a colleague, what are we going to do with this specific issue? Or you need to find a way to convince the management to do something with it, or anything in that area. So I think there should be more there. One very interesting thing as well is I once heard a PhD student in a focus group say, well, we don't work with people, so we don't need an ethics committee. And I think that was a really, really interesting thing to say, because any technology that they develop or test or whatever has impact on people. So in that sense, I think there's still a lot of work to be done in these educational settings or in these certificates to help them see that as well.
So I have kind of a two-part question, and the first question's more about adding context to the second one. But from what I've seen here in the US, right, we don't have a standardized curriculum for IT in like the K-12 years, right? Like growing up kind of still a minor, still under your parents' purview. And so I wonder, one, what does that look like in the Netherlands? Are, younger students getting exposure to computer science and technology and all that? And then the second half is, if that is the case, where does that responsibility lie to be teaching ethics? Is it something parents should be, discussing with their kids as they're monitoring their online behavior? Is this something a school should be providing if they're providing IT curriculum? I'm kind of curious what that looks like there, and then what your thoughts are on the responsibility side of it.
Yeah, I think more and more people are developing educational materials in this area. So I think that at least many of the sort of guest lectures at schools, etc., they really also include an element of, okay, let's discuss where the guidelines or the boundaries are and what you can and cannot do. But it's really, you have to be a bit lucky, I think. So it's not something that's standardized in any way. So it really depends on which school you are, if they have these guest lectures or any other events that you might be able to go to, or if you have an IT teacher who really understands you, or because I also have heard people say, well, the IT department of my school clearly had no clue about the stuff that I was doing, for example. So yeah, that really depends on where you are, I guess, to what extent you get that education. So I guess my main idea there is that it should be more standardized to be able to reach everybody and not only the people that are lucky.
Well, we've been talking for a while, and this has all been really, really interesting. Is there anything that you want people to take away from what you've talked about so far? Like, what's the top line, one sentence you want people to know?
Well, I think that hacking is ambiguous behavior. It's not either criminal or either moral. It can be a lot of different things. So if you look at hacking, you should really look at what is somebody is doing and what might influence that behavior.
I think that is an excellent point, well said. And this is a topic that I know, at least between the four of us, we could probably keep talking for a long time.
Yeah.
And I know I, for one, am really curious to hear the results of your study and how things go, not only from just the findings, but also the process part. I think that's really interesting. It seems as though we've kind of lost some of the qualitative thread in our field, so it's good to see somebody bringing it back. So we'd love to have you back on when you have time.
Yeah, that would be nice. Thank you.
No problem. So it was great to have you, and thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time we cross the firewall.
Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.